Welcome to this week's episode of A Little Better. My name's Daniel. I'll be your host. Today on the podcast, we talk about the church. What is it? Who is it for? And what is its activity supposed to be? Find out that and so much more on today's episode. Remember, our goal on this podcast is to know Jesus better and by the power of his Spirit, do better. So together we can be a little better. Hey, welcome to this week on A Little Better. Drew, this past Sunday, you preached week 3 of a church that pursues people far from God. Now, why do we use that wording at all? Like, we were going to say people that loves people far from God. Like, why do we change it from love to pursue? Do we not love them?
We do love them. I think, again, it really just comes down to how abused the word love is in our culture, in our context. And, a lot of people say they love people, but behind that love is there's a lack of action. To pursue somebody, you can't do it without doing something. Yeah. You can't say I'm pursuing you and not moving, right? It doesn't make sense. And so I like the movement, the action of the word pursue. I think if you pursue something, you love it too. So it's really tied in there.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, last week, the action word was fight for unity. Yeah. But you could say we're loving people inside the church, we're loving people outside the church, but these are the actions we take. That's good.
And so I'm just curious in the round of like at church, while we talk about a bunch of people who aren't at church, like in the regard of, isn't the church for Christians or followers of Jesus? Isn't the church for Christians? That's a specific wording that I'm selecting. Isn't the church for Christians or believers in Jesus?
Okay, so let's just talk about the church for a while. Even in this series, I almost started with a church that understands what the church is. As I think, I really believe this fundamentally, many Christians don't even understand the word church. Mm-hmm. It's become so, and honestly, some of it is just the fault of the church in teaching this or reminding people of this, because we've gotten to this place where church is buildings, right? The church gathers in a building and we become a building, but really that's never what the church has been. The church is the family of God. It's believers. Okay, so when people say the church is for believers, I believe that is completely inaccurate. I think the better statement is the church is believers, and the church is the hope of the world. The church is for people far from God. Because if the church is for believers, then how does anybody become part of the church? Right? I think about all the people who have met Jesus. Like Northridge is their spiritual home where they found the truth of the gospel. If the church is just for believers, why do we even bother preach the truth of the gospel? Yeah. Because if everybody knows it, what's the point of talking about it? Let's talk about sanctification all day long. I think so many, again, I told you guys, I'm going to get on a little bit of a tangent here, so you guys sit back and relax.
Sit back, yeah, that's what I was
why are we still here, right? Let's just get on up to heaven. I mean, why are we still here if it's just about us?
Yeah, and I think some of it is we have taken the word church and used it to mean all the following things: the people of God, the building that we gather in, the gathering itself. Like we've used that same word to mean all those things, and so the understanding of the word church has become so distorted. Like you were saying, it's like, the church. Oh, I'm the church. We go to church, and that building over there is the church. It's like, wait, what? Like, how can a building and a gathering all be the exact same thing? And you're bringing some clarity here of like, okay, so if the church is believers, and the church is for those who are not yet believers, right? We're using that in hope. Then what does it look like for the church to pursue those people who are far from God?
Right. I would even add to what you said. The church is not Sunday either.
Yeah.
Because again, we think church is a Sunday thing, but the church is the church Sunday through Sunday, Sunday through Saturday. Yeah. And again, even when people say the church is for believers, well, how does that work? Like even from Sunday to Monday, like, okay, again, Okay, I'm off my tangent. How do we? I just think so many people get caught up in this. I have dealt with this so much in the last 6 years of just trying to reorient people's minds on, man, we are the church. Mm-hmm. We are believers, but we are for the world. We are for the gospel. Mm-hmm. And that means we need sanctification. So the Bible says the church is to equip the saints to do the work of the ministry. So sometimes Sunday is just equipping, like, hey, but what are we equipping for? Just to be equipped? No, we're equipped to bring the hope of the world to the world.
To do the work of the ministry.
Exactly. Right? So, and a part of that is pursuing people far from God. Right.
But you might think it's like, getting all the right answers on a doctrinal exam.
Yes.
Party allegiance, right? Just standing up for the right things. Those are the kinds of things. Well, it's really important. And it is.
It is.
It is important to be doctrinally pure and correct. But that's not an end in itself.
That's right. Yeah. We have not achieved the end goal if that's what we are.
Right.
Right. And so I think a big part of, who the church is supposed to be is this movement of people that loves the world so much, that lives out the gospel so much, that the world looks at the church, not the building, not the Sunday, but the group of people who stand under the name of Jesus, and they wonder and they long for what they have.
Yeah. I remember I was on a mission trip in England, and Mike Taylor was our missions leader for UK USA Ministries, and he was doing a training for our team, like right before we went out one day, and he said, we tell our people here, live in such a way that people ask why. And I've just remembered that question. It's been years since I've been on that, but that's what what does it mean to be salt and light? You live in such a way that people ask why.
Yeah.
And so what is it, wrestle that question down. If you're listening, or I've had to wrestle with that question so many times. Am I living in a way that people ask why? And it's not that I'm being ridiculous or crazy or really anything like that, but okay, am I doing that in all the spheres of influence that I'm walking in? Am I living in a way that people ask why?
I mean, you're making these callbacks really to the Sermon on the Mount. The salt and light.
Yeah.
I love that word kingdom, right? It's like we have a kingdom here. It just doesn't operate like the way you think a kingdom should. There's so many things that are inverted and different about it. And one thing is, it's not for the king and those inside. It's for those outside.
Yeah, yeah. And pursuit is just this mentality of, I have something so good that people need to have it, right? Like, again, I think this might be overused, but like, if we had the cure to cancer and we held it,
right?
Like, how awful of human beings are we?
Oh, yeah.
And yet we have the cure to something way bigger than cancer, something way stronger than cancer. And yet, if we are not pursuing people with that cure, like, what are we here for?
I think you're hitting on some things that you covered in the message as well, but there's these like dynamics of like our heart for the nations, or our heart for, those far from God, is like, we have this desire to give them something that we have experienced that, has made our lives so much better and gave us a proper understanding, or at least a beginning of a proper understanding of like the world and what is the meaning of my life, the meaning of the universe, kind of all those kind of things. And then we move that to action, and we live in such a way that people ask why, but we don't use that. I'm going to miss who quoted this, but like, we don't say preach the gospel and if necessary use words like we don't have that. We live in such a way, but we also share our faith, pray, invest, and invite. We're going to share our faith. So how do we do that in not a belligerent way, but like in a winsome way, in a compelling way?
I think I think people would automatically go to practical here. I think the first thing that needs to happen in a believer's heart is that your heart actually aligns with God's. And I think if you don't have that, you're going to miss a lot in the practical side. I think our heart needs I said this in the message, break for what God's heart breaks for.
Yeah.
And our pursuit for people far from God needs to match God's pursuit. And think about that. Think about God's pursuit for you and I, right? He gave up his one and only son. That's pretty ridiculous and pretty scandalous and pretty, I guess, hard to match.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying offer your kids up to reach people for God. That's not what I'm saying. But our pursuit, the only way our pursuit matches God's is if our heart aligns with God's. And so I think the first step practically is to have your heart not become bitter towards lost people, but to be broken for them. And I think there's a fine line there. And I think what has happened over the course of the last 3 years and all the things that we've gone through, many Christians' hearts towards the world have not become broken, they become bitter. There's almost a hatred towards lost people and how they believe and what they believe, that it separates us to actually reach the people we're supposed to reach.
I think there's another alternative. You talk about brokenness versus bitterness. I'll just say on my stage of life, and Karen and I as empty nesters, and there's brokenness and comfortable. You know, I mean, I've got my cozy space. You know, I'm kind of loving life. I like my friends. You know, I love being here. I love singing the songs. I love, you know, it all feels good. You know, and it's very easy for me to just get way cozy here.
Yeah, it's almost that mentality, that old church saying, "Us four and no more," right? That holy huddle. Like, it's like, man, I love my community group. I love, you know, my campus. I love my church. I love all these things. I don't want them to change. And
it comes back to that mentality. The church is for me, right?
Yeah.
This is about me.
Right,
and like,
right.
you know, and again, that can be a good desire, right? Like, I want to grow and be sanctified. But if it just becomes all about you, you miss a big picture of the church. And so practically, I think you got to align with God's heart, right? You got to match his pursuit. You got to get over your comfort. And then stop trying to change the entire world. And start with one person.
Yeah, who's your one? Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, again, I'm this person, right? I'm a big dreamer. And so I'm like, okay, if I'm going to go after it, I'm literally going to change all of Rochester, right? With one sermon. It's just going to be so good that all of Rochester repents, right? It's going to be like the guy who didn't go to Nineveh. What's his name?
Jonah.
Jonah. Yeah.
I was about to say Noah.
I got a couple letters. Yes, we are your pastors over here, guys.
How many animals did Moses take in the ark?
But honestly, just start with one relationship. Start with your neighbor. Start with a coworker. You don't have to change the entire world. If we all just changed one relationship, we might actually reach the world.
Yeah, absolutely. It's that you know, focused mentality of caring for, you know, what if you just reach the house across the street, just your neighbor, you know, that their driveways lines up with your driveway. What if you just did that one person? Like, what would it look like to?
I was in a church once where a guy in his sermon, he did this illustration. It was like live in the audience, and so he basically, hey, I need two people to stand up, and so they stood up, they came up front, and he's like, hey, I want you to go grab a friend because you're going to reach that friend. And he grabs one of their friends, okay? And he comes back and he's like, hey, I want you to do the same thing. So you got two people there. And then he's like, hey, your friends stay here. You go get another friend. But actually, I want you to train your friend to reach another friend. And so you both go. And it just showed the power of multiplication versus one person doing it all. He said, like, hey, if we can learn that part of our mission is to pursue the lost, look at the difference. There's like, 120 people versus like, I don't
7.
know. Yeah, like 7 people.
Yeah. It's that
versus addition.
It reminds me of, in math class where you're like, well, you take a penny a day, and like double it every day. By the end of the month, would you rather have that? Or what if I gave you like $20 right now? Like, and it's like, it's like, what choice? You're like, oh, I'll take the $20, but then you miss out on like hundreds of dollars, like
lots of money
down the road. Yeah. So in light of that, what is the practical? So we talked about the heart. So how do we move practical? So if we have a heart that's like God's, we're like, okay, I want to reach the lost. I have so many friends that come to mind. I'm focused on this one. Okay, what do I do?
I feel like our practical is very well outlined. Pray, invest, invite. Mm-hmm. So with that one relationship, start with prayer. God, hey, my neighbors, hey, my coworker, give me opportunities to build a relationship with them. Lead the right relationship into my life. So like everything starts with prayer. So pray, God, you show me where to go, who to speak to, help me invest in that relationship. So like, okay, beyond work, invite them over for dinner, right?
Yeah.
Hey, go to the park with them, have play dates or whatever that looks like. And then ultimately to the point where you invite them to church. You invite them to a relationship with Jesus. You talk about your faith. You share your faith. You talk about how God has worked in your life. Again, I don't, in that invite section, I don't want us to get so caught up in inviting to church. We're really ultimately inviting people to Jesus, to a relationship with Jesus.
Like the church is not a building. The church is not a service.
Exactly. No, I think a step in invite could be like, hey, I would love for you to check out my church. There's nothing wrong with that. Yeah. But the end goal is not for someone to come to church. The end goal is for them to experience Jesus.
Yeah. Right. And we want them to be plugged into a local body of believers who are the church, like we said earlier. And so in that practicality, what if somebody's like, man, Drew, I'm struggling on the invest side. or I don't know how to pray. Like, let's start with prayer. The easy thing is like, okay, what exactly am I praying for? Like opportunities, but how do I pray for that person? Well, what does it look like to pray for a specific person that I know is not a follower of Jesus?
I would say soften their heart, right? That's
good.
You know, soften their heart, give me opportunities to share in a non-weird or extreme way about my faith. And give me windows to hear their story and to build a relationship with them. I think what's important is you have to have urgency, but your urgency can't outweigh there. Let me ask you, put it like this. I'll ask you guys a question. Is there a wrong way to share the gospel?
It would be easy to say, no, there's not. But like we've all seen those cringy ways of like.
We've certainly seen ineffective, counterproductive ways. Things that I say, dude, you just made my job harder.
Yes. So I think sometimes our urgency gets in the way of like the impact, right? And so delicate balance.
Yeah,
there's no perfect recipe, but just have that. Pray God would show you that balance, right? I think that's why prayer is so important. Like, hey, God, I want to be urgent with your message because, hey, we don't know what tomorrow brings. But I also want to be sensitive to, is that person ready to hear it? Is that person, you have those opportunities that the Spirit is leading you to? So
yeah, and I think there's some heart posture there too, right? Because like it's not that we never want to have a spur of the moment conversation with a stranger.
Right, sure.
It's like, oh, well, I'll never share the gospel like an elevator. Like we don't want to have that mentality. But some of it feels like you as the believer, me as a follower of Christ, need to be aware and have a heart like God's of like, I'm always on the lookout, right? Like I'm praying in the morning during my quiet time, like God, give me opportunities today.
Right.
Not just like, I want to have that one person in mind that I'm intentional investing with, but like if there's an opportunity to bless someone in the grocery store at Wegmans, like, or the cashier, like if there's opportunities to plant seeds of faith, like I want to do that on the regular basis.
Well, if anybody pushes back on that, look at Jesus' life.
Yeah.
Right? Jesus didn't walk around. It took a while for Jesus even to declare who he was.
Yeah.
Because people weren't ready for it. And so Jesus didn't walk around saying, you need me, repent, follow me.
Right.
He could have easily done that his whole life.
Yeah.
He didn't. He built relationships. He leveraged the church, right? Like his disciples to bring that message. And so anybody who pushes back on the sensitivity of presenting the gospel and sharing your faith in a timely manner, that's what Jesus did. That's how he lived. And so,
yeah. So what are good spaces of invite? We talked about pray. We talked about invest. You talked about, we don't want to just say invite people to Northridge service. What are other things to invite them to, and how can we intentionally do that well? Like, what are those things?
Well,
go ahead.
I mean, all kinds of incremental tiny things. I'm thinking about it starts with relationship. So that investing and inviting overlap in some ways, right? Because you're inviting them to opportunities to invest in them.
Yeah.
You're inviting them to share your space, to do things together. I mean, I'm just trying to think in a real practical way. I'm still reeling from week one, in terms of a family that belongs. I just know there's this family across the street that I know I had no interest in connecting with them because it just looks like chaos, over there. And I'm not sure how to step into that. But, I just even knowing their names, I mean, good. I do find it interesting. I usually talk to my suburban friends. It seems like they know far fewer of their neighbors than I do. I know 9 of the 10 houses around me. I know them all. There's that one house though that I need. It needs to be 10 out of 10.
Yeah, for sure.
But you need to connect with that house. But for some reason, the city is a little more intimate. I feel we're certainly physically closer together in the city. But overcoming my fear, making those tiny invitations.
I also even think like practically, like you don't need the church building or a message to lead somebody to Jesus.
No.
I think a church actually...
You mean a message by like a sermon, right?
Yeah,
right,
a message, sermon, keys behind it. Like here's the moment where you pray the prayer. Like I think a church becomes really powerful when people are leading people to Jesus in their homes and in their business places. And, like, wow, can you imagine that? Like, we don't have to wait till Sunday to offer the gospel to somebody, but like all throughout the greater Rochester area where we're sharing the good news and the hope of Jesus. And we're asking people, hey, in a sensitive way, in a timely way, when you've prayed invest, like, hey, do you want a relationship with Jesus? And we're not like, oh, wait, you got to come to church because
come to
our
church on
pastor's
Sunday.
going to preach the gospel and he'll tell you how to do that. Like, I'm saying, hey, let's pray right now.
Right.
Let me introduce you to Jesus now. Can you imagine how amazing? That's the early church, right? They, in their relationships, in their homes, throughout the community, they were introducing people to Jesus.
Yeah. And I think part of that is coming back to that comfortable question, right? Like, are we praying that God, are we excited about being uncomfortable about our community group growing, our campus growing, our church growing as a whole, like of, having those relationships with that one house, right? Of across the street. Like, are we praying, because it's hard to get excited about being uncomfortable. Nobody's like, man, you know what I love? One of my favorite things is being uncomfortable, right? Like nobody loves that, but it's in those uncomfortable moments that God grows us.
Yeah.
God shifts our heart for what breaks his. Like God is moving and active in our life in those uncomfortable spaces. Nobody ever grew from saying, you know what, I'm just comfortable all the time.
Yeah.
That's how people get.
Well, they might grow this way.
Yeah, in a circle.
Like their weight might grow.
Yeah, exactly. You don't grow and become more like Jesus in those comfortable spaces of your life.
Yeah.
You grow and look more like Jesus when we are pushed outside of that comfort zone.
Yes.
Last thing I want to talk about, Drew.
And you're certainly driven to pray more.
Yeah, go
I
ahead.
also want to say something. Like, okay, let's go back to my tangent, right? Like the church is, for believers. So, that's all about sanctification. And here's what I've learned in my life, and I've seen this in so many people's lives, right? If you're living that mentality, you want to be sanctified, right? One of the most sanctifying things is pursuing people far from God.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You want to grow. It's like you said, you want to get uncomfortable and you want God to grow your heart and grow your faith and sanctify you. Chase after lost people. And I promise you, you will become different while leading people to Jesus.
Yeah, because like you read the Gospels and the people that Jesus interacted with, right? And, there's so many times that if I've read through the Bible, I don't know how many times, or read through the Gospels, I don't know how many times, but I've just glazed over that, right? And if you sit down and think about one of those stories of Jesus encountering someone that was the outcast, the woman caught in adultery, the woman at the well, like all these different people, the tax collectors, Simon, all these people that we would be like, I'm not getting caught dead with those people, and we just glaze over that, like, oh, that's a good story. But if we sit down and really think like, these are the people that Jesus was pursuing.
Yeah.
These are the people that Jesus was like, I'm building a relationship with. I'm coming to your house tonight. Like thinking about that is like, okay, does my life look like that? And obviously we know from week one, we're not Jesus. We can't, we have to have healthy, God-fearing relationships in our life so that we can become sharpened. Iron sharpens iron.
Yep.
But what does our pursuit look like? Are we building, do we really care about those people far from God? And are we doing what it takes to pursue them? So let's one challenge from each of us as we wrap up. One thought to close out on that you want to reiterate. You can say something we've already said. One thought to leave people with.
I think my one thought is if I'm disinterested in the lost, I'm probably pretty far from appreciating my salvation. I'm pretty far. I mean, I think I'm probably thinking a little more of myself, than I should, and just not experiencing the brokenness, the grace, the love. I mean, I just need to. I think we've mentioned it several times this year, but that book, Gentle and Lowly, just how it just breaks your heart, but lets you bask in the mercy and love of Jesus. So if you don't care about the lost, you might not know how far God went to save you.
Yeah, that's so good.
Well said. I would say when the church becomes about you miss the point and the person of the church. The church isn't about you. It's not about what you like and what you don't like. It's not about what you want to hear and what you don't want to hear. It's about Christ and what he accomplished for you. And so I think that should sanctify you, and that sanctification process often comes through your pursuit of those who aren't part of the church yet.
I would say the last thought, the one that just keeps ringing, is if you're comfortable, you're probably not growing. If you're comfortable, you're probably not growing. And so thanks so much for tuning in this week's episode. We hope this was challenging and helpful in your walk with Christ. We can't wait to hang out with you again next week.